Hey, back with another story in my Canadian short story project. These being stories all from a curated thing of like stories to read while you're in hunkered down in the pandemic. Today I'm doing 100 Knives in the Air by uh, Pashima Mala. And it's a story about a school, one of those poor luckless entertainers who goes to schools to entertain the kids. Uh, and though this is a kind of a very kind of fable-like story where uh, the, uh, the, uh, the entertainer Jenny Bollock is throwing knives up into the air and maybe juggling them or something like that. But instead of it being three or four knives, it's like it ends up it's like 100 knives. And as she's telling the story specifically to a Yusuf Abdallah, who is actually the only one who actually kind of stays in close, because as she's telling the story, knives start dropping, one or two. A big butcher knife just comes whooshing down and slams into the parquet, and like the teacher's like, "Oh, why don't you back up, kids?" And everyone backs up, except for Yusuf, who stays wrapped. And Yusuf seems to be he's the kind of the kid who's troubled, who is so anxious about a math test he barfed into his desk. But he's wrapped by this story that she's telling, and she's telling the story about a knife that lives with its family on a metal strip. But this knife Gregory can't cut, and like the parents try and teach him how to cut, but he just can't. The father takes him aside. It's like, "Hey, look, here's a pat of butter. I've let it sit out all day. It's super easy to cut. See?" But then when Gregory tries to cut it, it's as hard. It's like a window pane. He can't. It's like he can't cut through it. And his mother also tries things like, "Oh, here's the string," and try. First we'll train you and train you and train you, but no, no. Gregory can never cut. And indeed, he's like, well, that's okay. Not everyone was made to be cutter. But Gregory's like, well, what's the use of a knife that can't cut? I guess he could go into spreading stuff, but it's like it feels like it's a complete failure. And I mean, he lives in a community where no one's trying to be mean to him. Everyone's like, "Hey, you do your best," and all that stuff. It's like all the negative stuff is coming from himself. So yes, Jenny's telling this story, but as she's telling the story, she's getting more and more exhausted. Sweat's coming down her. She's sweating in the most embarrassing places, apparently, in this Sienna. Was it Sienna? Which is like a purple, is a blue green jumpsuit. Cayenne jumpsuit, which turns navy with all her sweat. And she starts dropping knives, as I said, and they start knocking down. The kids back up, and then a knife comes down and it slices her hand, and she's like, but she keeps on doing, but she's spraying blood on herself, and they quickly are ushering more and more kids out, like the lower grades and then the next grades up, until it's just like the oldest grade, with Yusef still staying put where it was, and a butterfly knife had gone skittering off somewhere. And it's finally at the end, she's not even telling the story anymore. She stopped the story with poor Gregory just not being able to do, not being able to do anything, and then just reels the knives in because it's the end of the performance. Uh, and she's like, she has to get her hand bandaged, but he's like, no, he's like, he stays there, and he says like, "Wow, that was a great story, hooray, hooray." He's the only one who claps, and she's like, "Yeah, thank you, thank you." And then he goes in to try and hug her, at which point the teacher immediately wraps his hands around. And so yes, he wants to hug her, but the teacher immediately comes in and grabs him and like holds him and kind of pulls him away, and he freaks out, and he's like, and he pulls out the butterfly knife, and they call in the two custodians to kind of basically subdue him, like get the knife out of his hand, and they take him to the principal's office. And he's sitting outside, and his father has been called in, and they're having a talk in the thing. And he's sitting beside Jenny, who is sitting there waiting to get her fee for her performance. Her hand is bandaged now. And he's like, well, what happened with Gregory? It's like, well, you know, it's a very long story. It's like, well, can't you just tell me the end? It's like, oh no, I can't tell you just the end. I have to tell you the whole story. It's like, and it would take a long time. So I don't know if we have the time. And he's like, tell me the story. Tell me the story. And it's like, please, 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 tell me the end. Get to the end. Get to the end. And that's how the story ends, with us not getting to the end, of not never knowing. But so yeah, it's an interesting story. I had trouble with the last story, which is Under the Taps, an Irish Canadian woman's story, which was very kind of metaphorical, but I didn't quite catch the metaphor in it. This one, like, I don't know if I know exactly what the story is about, other than there's a whole thing of like, you have a school which is very kind of regimented, but sometimes art gets in, stories get in, and they touch kids, and sometimes they make the kids disruptive, because that's something, it hits something really raw, something really urgent for that kid. And there's the whole thing about the blood gashing out and like quickly ushering out the younger kids, and it's like, not letting Yusuf kind of hug Jenny at the end. It's sort of like, no, you shouldn't have that strong of a reaction to art. But it being a vital thing for Gregory, because Gregory's like, what happened to that really sad kid? Because it's like, oh yeah, it's like one sad kid seeing another sad kid in this artist's story. So yeah, that's 100 Knives in the Air, by Pasha Mala, which is like, that's kind of a good story. I'm not as always good with kind of what stories that are very kind of more openly, this means something. This is like a fantastical story, but that those fantastical elements they're supposed to kind of have a real world. They're an allegory for something, and you're encouraging the reader to kind of fill into that allegory. And obviously I filled it in with sort of one idea. And like all the knives, some of the knives are like, there's a kirpan, there's a jinsu knife, there's like all these knives of like, different cultures, different, stuff, and just the idea of like, giving these knives inner lives of a family of knives, and Gregory being a knife that can't cut. And it's like me juggling knives, maybe like someone juggling words. It's like, these words mean something. They are analogous to people, to your thoughts, to your feelings, is that idea of juggling. And it's how the strain that puts on an artist, and the pain of fumbling something, of letting it fall to the floor, of letting it slice you. It's like, it's kind of that visceral thing of an artist. So yeah, I really enjoyed that story. That was a cool story. All right. More videos and more stories later.